Seasons Bleatings, everybody! So, I'm reviewing Come Sing for the Harrowing by Dan Coxon today because this is one of the best collections I think published this year. I read quite a lot of collections through 2024 and Come Sing for the Harrowing is in that top bracket for me, and I thought it deserved a little bit more thought and some more comments because people seem to really like how much I broke down the Elemental Forces anthology when I reviewed that, and I talked about every story. So I thought I'd do the same for this because I think this is really strong, and once again every story is worth talking about. So it opens with its title story, Come Sing for the Harrowing, and it's about a guy called Jack that gets a new job, and he's got like that standard sort of new at a job kind of anxiety where everyone else knows each other, and he doesn't really have his little friendship group yet, and he doesn't know how people are taking him, and he starts to get a little bit paranoid that people are talking about him, and he's also seeing something a little weird as well that nobody else seems to notice. And I wasn't really sure where this was going to go. I had some idea, but I didn't realise we were going into folk horror, which was really delightful because folk horror is just one of my favourite subgenres at the moment. It was ushered into me by Adam Neville, and now I can't get enough of it, whoever's writing it. And I think I have said this in another video. At the time this is going up, I don't remember if that other video has come out yet, so if I'm repeating myself here, I'm sorry, but I think that short form folk horror, when it's pulled off, is really, really effective because it's a short amount of time to set up or at least clue you into this whole wider world of like belief and rituals and like a social societal structure, whatever it is. And Dan Coxon absolutely nails it every single time. It's really, Dan Coxon is the guy that has given me such a love for short folk horror stories. So anyway, it gets a little folk horror, and it doesn't shy away from what you would class as typical horror elements. The kind of stuff that people who don't like horror don't like. If that, I don't want to say too much without spoiling it because I was just so impressed with the ending. Dan just kind of went for it, and it was a really good climax to a really sort of tense and stress-inducing story. The second story is unlike anything I've read before. The Wives of Tromile. I think I've pronounced that correctly, but please correct me if I'm wrong. So this is about a woman. This initially to me felt like it was a wholesome story, by the way, like it was sort of kind of nice, but then actually the briny underbelly was exposed like the further you read into it. It's about a woman who hasn't spoken to her mother in 5 years, and then she hears word from her and goes home because her geriatric mother is pregnant unexpectedly. So this is a grown woman finding out that her much older mum, like quite old for motherhood, is expecting a new baby. And this didn't feel folk horror. It's not folk horror, I mean, or is it? It does have some it has some mythology to it. I don't know if this is based on anything in real folklore or mythology or anything like urban legend, even anything like that, or if Dan just completely made it up. But there's a weird reason, obviously, that this lady is pregnant, and it does speak of the wider community of women as well, and I just really enjoyed it. It made me feel gross, but like in a complimentary way to the story. The next story I'd actually read before because this is was originally printed, I think, in Great British Horror 7, I want to say, and it's called Bring Them All Into the Light. And I remember absolutely, I was delighted to come across it in this collection because on the first page I remembered that it was one of my favourites from Great British Horror 7. It's about a guy and his family. They move into this new house, and it's a bit of a fixer-upper, and he's really excited about it. And he gets obsessed with, there's like a little hill behind the house, if I'm remembering correctly. Sorry, I have recently read this, but I read a lot, as you know, so I don't always retain every detail of everything, but I remember the images I had when I was reading it. So he gets a bit obsessed with this hill, and I think he's building stairs into it. There's some element like that. He gets a little obsessed with his construction plans, and they also might be a supernatural entity. Not a ghost, though. Um, maybe manipulating him or steering him a certain way, and it was, yeah, it was just so strange and cool, and again, like, quite unique. But Dan does unique pretty well, even when he's writing in a well trodden subgenre. Next is Bumble Thatch, and this one made me a little sad because it reminded me of my early school years. It's about a girl who is friends with a boy who it's unwise socially to be friends with because, you know, he's the target of bullying, and if you're friends with him, then you're going to get bullied as well. But this girl's friends with him, and they sort of socialize just the two of them together outside of school and away from other people and things. And it just really reminded me of me because at various parts of my primary school education, I was that kid, and my only saving grace in that situation was that I wasn't the most picked on kid, but I was kind of at some point a bit of a social pariah, and I just felt very like a weirdo. Like, I went to school feeling like I didn't fit a lot. I was bullied a bit, and then when I wasn't bullied, I was kind of just not talked to. So this one got me in the feels, and it does go in a direction that I kind of expected, but it was really well set up, and yeah, this one made me a little sad. Also, it was creepy. Oh, the next one is called A Broken Vessel, and I think this is one of the most like fun horror stories in the collection. It's about three experienced criminals that decide to rob an old millionaire, and it doesn't go well for them. And initially, I don't know why I thought this was going to happen, because like I said, Dan is very good at unique stories or unique storytelling. But I thought it was going to be similar to that film. Oh, I can't remember what it's called now, but you know, the one with those like late teenage or early adult criminals break into that old man's house because he's blind and they think he's an easy target, but then he kicks all their asses. I thought it was going to be something like that. It goes south for these criminals, but not in any way that you would predict. Although, actually, he is an old millionaire, so maybe you should predict it. But yeah, I can't say anything. I can't tell you what I loved most about it without spoiling it, because my favorite thing about the whole story was when you realize like what's actually happening, and I don't want to like rob somebody else of like the fun of getting to that point in the story. But yeah, this was really, really fun. Probably one of my favorites in the collection, although it's quite hard to pick favorites in here, to be honest. Vile Jelly was the next one, and this was probably my least favorite because I'm very squeamish about eyeballs, and I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about this story, but I will say this. Apparently some eyeballs are worth more than others. Ugh. From the Earth is the next story, and I loved it. This is like really one of my favorite. I say this is like one of my favorites in the collection, but this is one of my favorites in the collection, and it managed. I've said this in my other video where I mentioned this when I did list this in one of my ranking videos, this whole collection. This one reminds me of a Clive Barker city. I was gonna say a Clive Barker city. Can you imagine a Clive Barker city? It reminds me of a Clive Barker story, and I think it's called In the Hills, the Cities, or In the Hills, in the City. There's something like that. Someone correct me in the comments. I just can't. It's so long since I read that story. But it's not. It's not. It's not really that. But that was the look, and yeah, the look. Oh, wait, those are words, aren't they? What I was picturing when I read this story in Dan's book was scenery wise is kind of the imagery I was getting from Clive's story. It's about a girl who's been isolated for her whole life pretty much by a religious community because they think that she has a direct line to God and that God speaks like directly to her, so she's passing along messages and things like that. They keep telling her that she's special and that she's been isolated because they have to keep her safe, but obviously it's just, you know, abuse and keeping her isolated so that she can't escape because they want to use her. and then they keep promising her you know, the chance of going outside for a walk or maybe seeing more people or whatever, and so she's excited about that when they actually let her out, but they have nefarious reasons for letting her out. And like with the other story, I can't tell you what is so great about this, because first of all, this could have gone in any direction, and the storytelling and the writing was so intriguing and interesting that I think I would have been happy wherever Dan took this story. But I would never, my brain would never, it would never think of what Dan thought of. So they take her to this well that she remembers from when she was a bit younger the last time they let her out. And there's, I can't tell you anything because I don't want to spoil the greatest. I think maybe that's the most fun thing about Dan's stories for me, is when the explanation or the revelation of what's happening starts coming out. It's so unexpected that it makes you really happy as a reader, because you didn't see it coming, even though Dan sets everything up quite well. So yeah, I can't really tell you any more about it, of what makes it so great, but it really is that third act that really pushes the story over the edge. So unique and original. Bodies on the Dance Floor is the next story. Completely different, complete tonal shift from the last story. This, I think I put in my written review that this story made me feel like me and Dan are on the same wavelength, because my idea of purgatory or hell is having to listen to Sean Paul, the same Sean Paul song over and over forever as well. So there is more to the story than that, but that was my main takeaway in this case. Shanapal. The next story is Clockwork, and it was so good. So is this sci-fi? It's not sci-fi like space and stuff, but as far as technology goes, a little bit. It's about a person who grows up with a horrible dad, and when their dad dies, it's very clear to us, the reader, that they could not care less, or they might even be reveling in the fact that the dickhead is finally gone. And this kid of this asshole, who's now an adult, is working through their trauma in a really interesting way, let's say. It's kind of wish fulfillment in its most horrific form, and there are revelations in this that like really steep up the quality of the story, and the character work as well. There was a quote in this one that I really loved: "We all gather damage over time," and I think that's so true, unfortunately. But yeah, I think that is true of everybody, and this story really resonated with me. I think it'll resonate with quite a lot of other people too. The Darkness Below is the next one, and this was my my absolute favorite of the collection, I think. This is about a family that go on one of those little caving expeditions, like a tourist thing where they walk around a cave, and the teenage son sort of disappears for like 5 minutes, but then when he comes back, he's absolutely fine. There was no cause for alarm, or was there? The dad is looking at this kid, nobody else is noticing anything off, but the dad's looking at this kid and thinking, that's not my kid. And the story gets progressively more tense, because I think I've said this in another recent video, I really love unreliable narrator stories, but there's like a level above that for me in terms of storytelling, and it's when we don't know if the narrator is unreliable. So like this, like I maybe I'm just saying the same thing, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but like a lot of the time when I'm in an unreliable narrator narrative, I know for a fact that the narrator you can't necessarily take them at their word. Whereas this story is, we don't really have any reason to doubt the dad and what they think, but also what he thinks is insane, so it's quite hard to believe. And there are indications for either way that sort of justify either mode of thought, and the balancing act of that was so good, because even at the end, when things really escalate, I didn't know. I know which way I think I prefer, because I always prefer the scarier route, but it's horrifying whatever you think is happening by the end, especially. The next one, told very differently, is called Long Gone, Slight Return, and it's told in interview format between a reporter and the members of a band, and someone in the band had gone missing before, and everyone sort of like talking about that from in the recent past, I think. This one, I didn't know what was happening for the longest time, but like not in a bad way, but just I was so curious, and it really plays with that uncanny valley kind of anxiety, much like the last story I talked about actually, where something's just not right and you can't put your finger on it, and it really plays with that kind of tension. So yeah, I can't say too much about that. The next story is called In Flickering Light, and it's about a man who comes across a homeless lady, and then he realizes that he knows her because she's an ex co-worker and they had this horrible boss. And and now this is where her life has led her, and he feels really sorry for her and wants to help and stuff. And there's a lot of information about the background and kind of what led the lady where she is and what happened with her at work, and it feels like a really real world horror story, but I wasn't sure because also there's something fucky. I can't quite explain, but it just made me feel very unnerved. In its most sort of like normal real world form, it's just a sad story that will probably make you quite angry, but if there's supernatural stuff, then it's also really creepy. So that happened also. The title of this next one I'm going to mess up, and I feel ashamed because it looks like a Welsh word, but as a Welsh person, from the south that lived in England for a lot of my younger life, I can't speak Welsh. And it might not be Welsh, it might just look Welsh, but I'm going to have to try and read it. It's called, allegedly, Goffwisfa? Goffwisfa. Goffwisfa. Anyway, I feel like there are two roads of thinking you can go down with this story to decide what's happening here. It's either oh God, it was so good. It's about a guy in a retirement home, and then simultaneously we're getting a narrative from the past as well, from someone that was in, I think it was like a workhouse, or yeah, like one of those like workhouse places where people can sort of just come through, earn a bit of money and go. So we're in alternating timelines, going back and forth, and I couldn't tell if this was a really, really intelligent karma story or one of those history repeating itself stories, possibly with some generational, increasingly bad fortune. But either way, it was really interesting and I was hooked. Grains of Sand was the next one, and it's about this creepy person called Tep that's looking for someone, and I wouldn't want to be that someone. And that's kind of all I have to say about this one. London Deep is the next story, and we're almost at the end of the book now, and we came all of this way without Dan throwing any cosmic horror in, and now here it is. And I don't want to go into the sewers of London ever. This is about a guy who has vanished, apparently without a trace, and someone's looking for him and seeing all of these notes and this research and stuff in the guy's apartment, but he just seems to have just up and left and no one knows where he's gone. But I mean, he's gone somewhere. And the book closes with Beyond the Beach, the Trees. Sorry, just making sure I got the title right. And again, this is a running theme with Dan. It always feels like there are a couple of different things that could be happening, and they're all built up plausibly. So I think it's really up to your own interpretation a lot of the time, and what you would prefer to be happening. Although, like, I don't know, saying that sounds unsatisfying, like there are no definitive endings, but that's not true either. I think that Dan's just struck a perfect balance between ending on a slight mysterious note, but also giving you the ending that you want. Does that, like, it's almost like a choose your own horror adventure without choosing your own horror adventure. I think he might be some sort of genius. Anyway, this is about a man who's on holiday with his family, and I think that he gets sunstroke because I've had sunstroke a few times, and I have never done anything like what happens in this story, but I just really very strongly feel like the sun was the enemy here. There's a reason why I always keep all my curtains closed, and I really welcome in the winter months when we've only got about 4 hours of daylight per day. But yeah, this just gets increasingly weird, and the guy's just getting more and more. I'm laughing because also there is a very dark, funny edge to this for me, but the guy's just getting more and more isolated, and things are just getting increasingly odd and worrisome. And it was just a really great way to close out the book. So overall, we've got a whole variety of subgenres. Like Dan's very particular way of ending stories in really satisfying ways, but that are still slightly open. I think that that's maybe one of his greatest strengths. It's taken me, I read this a few weeks ago and I've been thinking about it this whole time. And I think it's taken me a while of sort of like ruminating on it for me to realise that that's what I love so much about his shorts, is the mystery, just such well crafted mystery infused in all the horror. So good. And yeah, lots of favourites, as you can tell. I think I said, oh, this is one of my favourites, or this is my favourite a couple of times as I was going along. There were no weak stories in here, just some that I preferred less than others, but they were still better than the best short stories I read in other collections, if that makes sense. So I really highly recommend this just to any horror fan. I think any horror fan that enjoys short stories would get a lot out of this. I've seen this appearing on a lot of people's favourite collection of the year, or stories in it have been included in people's favourite short stories of the year lists as well. So I think, yeah, it's recently released. This is still pretty brand new, I would say. I will obviously put a link in the description for it, and I'll put a link in the description for, I'm sure Dan has a website. I'll just make sure that you can find him there as well. Really well worth checking out. I wouldn't sit here going through this story by story if I didn't love this and sincerely think a lot of people would really enjoy it. So yeah, well, what else can I say about this book? There was a little... I see you watching and not subscribing, and if you don't, I'm gonna cut Kaylee's hair off. See you next time, bleed!